Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Tzadi Gimel. We're going to continue where we ended yesterday. So we started with our Mishna. If you recall, let's just do a quick review. The Mishna was about someone who sells seeds and then the seeds don't grow. And the question is, right, only if the seeds are only for planting, then the original seller is responsible. But even if it's something that mostly people buy for planting or half-half, right? Then the owner is not responsible. Then we went in the Gemara to a machloket, a debate between Rav and Shmuel about if somebody sells an ox that turns out to be a goring ox, and the buyer comes back and says, hey, I wanted an ox for plowing, and now I have to get rid of this animal, and I'm not going to have an ox, and I want my money back. Well, even though most of the people generally buy oxen for plowing, some people buy them for slaughtering. And therefore, Shmuel said, there's no claim because the seller can say, well, I sold you one that's good for slaughtering, and sorry, I can't help you. Rav says, what do you mean? We go by majority. If the majority of the people buy for plowing, then of course they get their money back. We had a bit of a debate about what the case, and we did a little fine tuning. Then we started with some questions on some of the approaches. So we had a bright Mishna. It was a Mishna in Ketubot, where it looked like we follow the majority. It looked like we don't follow the majority. If we had followed the majority, we would say most women get married as betulot, and then she wouldn't even need witnesses, right? But she does need witnesses, and then that seemed to go against Rav. But they resolved it by answering it and by explaining that there were some other factors to consider, and this wasn't a problem. Then, and I got stuck at the end of Daf, and I realized that there were some commentaries that asked the same question I did, so we'll talk about it right now. The next source we brought was a difficulty on Rav, which then seemed to go more like Shmuel, and that's where I struggled a little yesterday. I'll try to explain it, and there were a few different possible answers. I don't want to get you crazy with different answers, but try to make it clear today, at least according to one interpretation. So the braita, the Tosefta here, it's a Tosefta, says the following. At the end of Tzadi Bet Amabet, somebody sells a slave, and it turns out the slave, so I go to buy a slave in the slave market, and again, we're talking about Canaanite slaves, in a time when there were such a thing as slaves, there's no longer anymore. I buy a slave in the slave market, and it turns out he's a thief or a kidnapper. So I want my money back, but I can't get it back according to the Tosefta, only if he's going to be convicted to the death penalty, either because he's an armed robber and might eventually get himself killed, or is already convicted. Then, I could get my money back because in the end, I bought a dead person, basically. So Reisha my time, the Gemara says, starting at the beginning of our daf, which we read this yesterday, La mishum deruba hachi, isn't it because the majority of slaves are thieves? And that's why when I buy the thief, I can't go complain and say, well, I didn't expect to get someone who's going to steal my stuff from me, because most of them steal. So that would follow majority. Now, the problem I had at the end of yesterday's daf was, according to Shmuel, though, Shmuel generally says there is no bitul mekach, right? The sale can't be canceled. Why? Because the seller already has the money. So if the money's in the seller's hands, I have to prove that I'm deserving to get the money back. So here also theoretically. So some people say, actually, it must be a case to say that this works with Shmuel. This is a difficulty to Shmuel. Sorry, I want to be clear. This proves Rav and it's difficult against Shmuel, because this proves, I hope I didn't say it the opposite before, this proves that we follow majority, right? That's the reason why, since the majority of slaves, right, that would mean that that I wouldn't be able to get my money back because I should have known based on majority. According to Shmuel, you would have to say like this: you can sort of either a Mutzim Chavero is not going to determine whether I get my money back or not, because before Mutzim Chavero was a case where I already paid the money, and that's why I'm having issues getting it back. In this case, I didn't pay the money. Some people say that's the case, even though it doesn't say that, but it could be it's before I paid the money. And that's why, according to Shmuel, we would have thought I'd be able to get my money back. And that goes against what the Tosefta says. But the Rashbam says a little bit more simply, which he doesn't really talk about the Motzim Chavero issue. right? And if you notice in the Gemara really was, do we follow the majority or do we not follow the majority, right? Shmuel said we don't follow majority in monetary cases. So if you don't follow majority in monetary cases, what would happen here? Well, it doesn't matter if most slaves steal or don't steal. The fact is, I bought a slave, and if we don't factor in this whole majority, the response is something interesting, which is, what happens? I went to buy a slave. Now, if we don't factor in most slaves are thieves, then when I claim in court, well, I bought a slave, I expected to get a good slave, meaning not someone who steals from me, well, then I'll be believed, because that's whether I know or not that whether it's true that there's a majority that are slaves or that are thieves or not, it's irrelevant. So the Rashbam even says it's like 50-50, right? Could be 50% of slaves and the other 50 are not 50% of slaves are thieves and 50% aren't, because there is no majority. So it's 50-50. So when that's the case, the question is, what did I know? So we basically say, well, since you didn't tell me that this one was a thief, then I have all the rights to get my money back, even if I already paid the money, because we don't follow majority. Majority is not a consideration, which means we have to use other considerations. Well, the other consideration is if I bought a slave, I obviously wanted someone who's not going to steal from me. So, right, as long as we don't have the rove telling us, well, you should have known because the majority of them are. But if Shmuel doesn't hold by rove, then there is no majority. So that's a way to explain Shmuel here and why Shmuel would say that in this case, it would actually be a canceled deal. Okay. So what is the Gemara answer? Because it's difficulty, right? It basically proves Rav goes against Shmuel. No, because this has nothing to do with Rov in the end. The Gemara says, lo, kulu hachi yitnehu. All of them are like this. All slaves steal. This isn't a law of Rov. This is a law of, it's just a fact. Fact is all slaves steal. So, okay, it's difficult for us to accept this. It's difficult for us to talk about slavery in general. It's even more difficult to talk about slaves, assume that all the slaves steal. But they basically say, in order to answer the question, right, the difficulty with Shmuel, we'll just say all of them do, in which case it's not an issue of Rov, or not everyone would agree. Since they all do it, I obviously have no claim. Well, I didn't think it was going to be a thief. Okay. Tashma, source number 3. And you might remember this from Bava Kama. The scene is, we get to a scene, we see a shore, gored another para, right? We saw that happen. And later we'll get to one where we didn't even see it happen. We don't know, did the shore do it or not? Here we saw the shore attack the para, but we didn't notice. Okay, we see now the para, the cow, has a newborn on the ground dead. And we don't know, was the newborn cow, okay, was the newborn cow, the calf, was it killed before? Did it die? Did the cow miscarry before the nigicha, meaning it had nothing to do with the ox? Or did the ox gore the cow and cause the miscarriage? So Einu Yodeh, this is exactly what we don't know. Einu Yodua, it's not known. Im ad shalona chayada, did she give birth to this dead animal before the goring happened? Oh, im mishna chayada, or was it on account of the goring? So mishalem chatzi nezik lapara. Well, no matter what, okay, we're talking about a shore that was a short time, so you're going to pay only half damages. It was a shore that hadn't gored it 3 times yet. So you're going to pay the owner of the shore, the ox is going to pay half damages for the cow, urivia livlad, and a quarter damages for the offspring, because we don't know, we're in safek, and mamona mutaba safek, if you have money that you're not sure what the status is, chokim, we split it 50-50. So instead of paying, right, it's either 0, they owe for the vlad, for the offspring, or 50%. So we'll pay 25%. Okay, you pay 25, the owner pays 25% of the value of the dead fetus, right? What it would have been. Va'amai, now why? Lema halachacha rov parot, v'rov parot mitabrot v'yodot. If we follow laws of majority, this would show we don't follow laws of majority against Rav. Because if we follow laws of majority, what will we say? Most cows give birth successfully. So the chances are very slim to none that the cow miscarried before the goring. It must be on account of the goring. So if you follow Dine Rov, you're going to basically make the owner of the ox pay 50% damages for the value of what the calf would have been had it been born. right? Okay, it's not really vadai. It's based on laws of rov, but based on laws of rov, vadai means definitely. It's not definitely, but laws of rov would say that we can assume, that's really the way we read the vadai here, we can assume it's mahmat nigicha. It's on account of the goring that the animal miscarried. So what's the answer? No, you got it all wrong. It's not, did the animal miscarry before the ox gored or not, or was it on account of the goring? Here's what the reason is for the doubt. Okay, I'm going to say it before we read it inside. No matter what, it's because of the shore. But still, there's a deliberation. Do you pay 0 or do you pay 50%? And that's why it comes out to 25%. Because the question is, you could say that maybe the ox came from in front of the cow, meaning the cow saw the ox coming to gore it, got scared out of its mind, and biatuta is scared. And because of the fear of the ox goring, that caused the miscarriage of its offspring. Which means, now, in that case, the ox caused the damage, but that's not direct damage. That's called indirect damage. In fact, you might remember we learned this in Bava. If you do that, if a person damages another person by scaring them and they die, the person is not liable, okay? Or if, cause damage. Like if I, go to kill you and instead you get so scared, you get a heart attack before I killed you. So I'm not liable in a human court, okay? Bidei adama, which means I am liable in a court of God because I really did cause your death. But that's what we call grama. It's indirect damages. So we can't make someone liable for indirect damages. Okay, also if it was mammon, if I caused you financial damage, right, or bodily damage, right, where you didn't die. Death would be capital punishment. So I'm bringing an example of that, but it would be also monetary damages. So we can't, if that's the case for sure in an animal, right, all the more so if it's not a human, all the more so you can't make someone liable for damages that were done from scaring someone. The ikad meimar me'acholat, or it could be though, the ox gored from the back, the cow never saw it coming, the animal miscarried, mingach nag chavi pila, miscarried because of the goring. So either which way, it's from the ox. Nobody thinks that the animal just happened, on the off chance just before the ox gored, but it could be because the ox was about to gore, the animal miscarried, and then that'll be 0 damages for the offspring. Or it could be it was on account of the goring, and therefore that's our safek, and therefore having mimana mutaba safek, and that's why it's money that we're not sure what to do with it. Are you obligated or are you not? Anytime we have mammon, we don't know, an obligation, a monetary obligation that we're not sure. Do you have to pay? Do you not? So we split it 50-50. So that's why this has nothing to do with loss of majority. Okay, next, lema kitanai. So if you remember, there were 5 sources we're going to bring. We already brought 3 of them. Okay, there was a Mishna in Ketubot, that was yesterday. There was the Tosefta, which we started at the very end of yesterday's daf and did it again today. And then there was this Mishna in Bava. Now we're going to bring a 4th source, which is going to suggest that lema kitanai, maybe it's a machloket tanaim. This machloket Rav and Shmuel matches a machloket tanaim. Usually lema kitanai is going to be rejected, as it will be here, although 5th source will actually prove it's a machloket tanaim, but this source won't. Shor shaya ro'eh, v'nimtza shor harog b'tzido. We have a shor who's grazing in the field, and then we see a shor who's dead next to it. So this is what we call circumstantial evidence, right? Now, the more so, wait till you hear what the Gemara said, what the Mishna, the braita says. Even if the animal that's dead was gored, and the animal that's alive is an animal that already was proven 3 times to be a shor mu'ad, a shor that gores, or or there's bite marks on the animal that's dead, and the shor that's alive, that's in grazing in that field, is already proven to be a shor that an ox that bites. Still, this is only circumstantial evidence. And therefore, ein omrim, we don't say, you can't say it's obvious that this shor bit or this shor gored and caused the death and obligate the owner. No, we don't do that. That sounds like, right? Even though this is not rov, but it's like rov, we're going to call it chazaka soon. Okay, that there's a chazaka What's a chazaka? Well, when someone does something 3 times, that's one way to create a chazaka. We assume it's just always going to happen. So if this shore already gored 3 times, we could assume next time it gored. Okay, but we don't follow that. Okay, so there you have. We don't follow Rov according to Shmuel, and we don't follow chazaka according to this. That seems like it's the same thing. And Rabbi Acha Omer, here comes the dissenting opinion. Gamal ha'ochil ben ha'gmalim, a cow. I'm sorry, a camel who is mating in the mating season, okay, and it's engaging in relations among other camels. V'nimtza gamal ha'ug b'tzido, and you find the dead one. You can assume that it killed because camels, when they're mating, they often kill. So this is similar. Now, it's not a chazaka that this cow did it 3 times, but it's basically saying, since this is what cows do when they mate, they kill. We assume that if one of the, camels, I keep confusing because of the previous one. If camels are generally known to do this, there's a chazaka that if a camel is mating and there's a camel dead, we can assume that animal, right, that camel killed the other. So why is he talking about camels when the other one was talking about other, oxen? The assumption is that he doesn't disagree about the oxen. He's even saying camels, which don't normally kill, if they're mating, they do. And of course, he would disagree about the ox who was a muad, a shor muad for goring, and then the animal was gored. For sure, we would make the animal responsible. It's not that he's saying, I only think in a camel case. He thinks really in all the cases. So that would match Rav, that we follow Rov. Okay, here we follow Chazaka, we follow Rov. And in fact, the Gemara is going to say it right now. Savruha, when they first thought, oh, same machloket, they thought, and Savrua is always rejected. Okay, so they thought, but it turns out they were wrong. Deruba v'chazaka ki adadin, Rov and chazaka are the same. We say most people do this, most animals do, right? So let's just compare. Most people buy animals for plowing. Most, right? If an animal gored 3 times, we're going to assume the animal will gore another time. That the strength of Rov and chazaka are the same. So if we're going to follow Rov and Dinei Mamonot, we're going to follow chazaka. If we're not going to follow Rov, we're not going to follow chazaka. And that's why these two opinions will match up perfectly with Rav and Shmuel. So Lema Rav de Amar Rabbi Acha, Shmuel de Amar Tanakama, right? And Rav will hold like Rabbi Acha, that we go by the chazaka, we go by the Rav. And Shmuel says we don't follow any of that, and we don't obligate the owner of the oxen, and we don't obligate the seller to give back. The person who says, "What do you mean? I bought it. I wanted this to plow with." And right, we follow, right, according to Shmuel, we don't follow Rov, and we don't allow that to happen, right? We don't get the money back. So, or, in the case of Rav Shmuel, right, and it's a nakhan, you don't get your money back. So that's what we think. But now the Gemara says, no, Rov and Chazaka are different. So Amar Lacha Rav. Rav could say, we're now going to say Rav and Shmuel can each make an argument that they side with the other one that we thought they didn't side with. Okay? Amar Lacha Rav. I would even agree with Tanakama in this case. Why? Again, Tanakama said, we're not going to obligate the short, even though we do follow Rov. We follow the majority. We let me return my animal when it turned out it was in a khan, because I say I was with the majority. I bought it for plowing. That's what most people do. But in this case, we won't follow and obligate the owner, why, of the cow to pay. What they say is we don't follow chazaka just because it was shor muad. There's no evidence to say that shore killed this shore. But when it comes to, do we assume I belong to the majority of people who choose to buy oxen for plowing? Yes, we can put me in that category. But not when it comes to chazaka. Doesn't mean that cow was the one who did it, or that ox, was the one who killed. Shmuel amar lacha, ana da amra filu the Rabbi Acha. I hold, even like Rabbi Acha, Shmuel could say, ad kan lo ka'amar Rabbi Acha hatam ela dazlina b'tar chazaka dehu gufe muchsa. In Shmuel, they explain it a little bit better. I'm going to try to explain it the way I understand it, which is, I say that because I think you can understand the distinction in 2 different ways, or in a few different ways. I'm going to explain it in a way that made sense to me. Rabbi Acha said we follow chazaka. Why? We can say that it was the shore, it was the camel, it was, right, that did it. Why? Because hu gufe muchsa. Because his body, this is a behavior that we assume is going, this is the nature of this animal. This animal is an akhan. The nature of a camel when it's mating is to kill. It's following its nature. we assume that things follow their nature. That's true. That's very different than rov. Chazaka is, right? This is the way we assume you're acting. Aval bataruba lo azlina. But when it comes to rov, we don't follow the rov. Because there, and I'm going to call it like this, it's nature versus preferences. By our case, it's a matter of when I bought, what was I thinking? Was I in the mindset of most people and wanted to buy it for plowing? Maybe I have my own unique way of thinking. Maybe I have my own unique way of buying animals. We don't necessarily assume that I belong to the majority. And this goes back, I think I've used this example before. But in studying economics, which I did many years ago, I remember there's a few things that stuck out in my head. And one of them was this, we had to do an assignment on if we lower the prices of public transportation, will that mean less people will drive their cars to work? Will resolve traffic problems. What can we assume that by lowering the price, that will make more people use public transportation? And it's hard to do a study like that because, obviously I was at elementary level of economics, but basically it's all based on people's preferences, and people's preferences are all different. Everybody has different permutations that go into that. Some people, their office might be near a train station, so it's very convenient. Other people, it might be far from it. Some people like to just be in control. They don't like being in a train. It could be delayed. It could be this, right? They'd rather be in their own car, even if it means you get stuck in traffic. There's so many factors and personality things that have to do with why someone might choose one thing or another, or all sorts of things. But when it comes to preferences, that's something different. When it comes to the nature of an animal or the nature even of the behavior of people, we create chazakas about, and then so it's a question. Are there certain things that we can assume are the nature of, right? Here we're comparing animals and humans. So it's a good, and that's why I say, this is my theory. It could be, you could call it something different. It could be, it's a bit of a different distinction because chazaka could also be about human behaviors. We make chazakas about human behaviors. And is this a general principle that Shmuel will say, we can go by chazaka always, just not by rov? Or is chazaka here what a person shows a propensity toward rather than what their preferences might be in terms of choosing? Do they go with the majority of people who do this? So it's a good question exactly how to distinguish rov and chazaka, but I thought of this nature versus preferences. Perhaps it's right, perhaps it's not. Okay, Tashma, last source, and this is our source, right? In the 5 sources, remember there was a siman for the 5 sources that we're going to take to discuss the machloket Rav and Shmuel. Okay, remember the 4th one, the first 3 were to say difficulty on Rav or Shmuel. The 4th one was to say maybe it's a machloket tanaim, but then we said no, it's not the same thing. And now the 5th one is our Mishna. And our Mishna, which we said from the beginning, doesn't really fit with Rav. Because Tashma, so I bought seeds and I planted them, nothing grew. Even flax seeds, which are mostly bought for planting, only sometimes for eating. You don't have to return them to me. Give me back my value of them. My afilu. Why does it say even zera pishtan? Lav afilu zera pishtan deruba lizriya zavne. And this is the way we explained it. Is it not because even flax seeds, even though most people buy them for planting, and you still afilu hachi lo azlina mataruba, we still don't follow the majority. That would go against Rav. To which the Gemara answers, you're right. The Mishnah really only works with Shmuel, so how can we do that? Rav can't disagree with the Mishnah, although sometimes we do say. But if we can come up with a better answer, we do, which is tannaitic. Actually, it's a machloket tanaim. How do we know? Titania, we're going to see in this following source, there's a machloket exactly about, now we finally have a proof that really it is a machloket tanaim, what Rav and Shmuel argue about. Hamocher perot lechaveros ra'am velot samchut. It's exactly our case. You sell produce to someone else. He plants them and they don't grow. If they're things that you plant that are only seeds that you only plant and nobody eats them, then chayab achayutan, and they have to give you your money back. Zera pishtane no chayab achayutan. But if it's flax seeds, they don't have to return your money. That's exactly our Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi Omer, turning out on a bet, Rabbi Yossi says, no tenlo demezeh. You give him the value of, even in the Zarei Pishtan, you have in the Zarei Pishtan, you have to return the value of the seeds because we follow majority. Amru lo, they said to him, what do you mean? The majority of people, okay, you're saying the majority of people buy Zarei Pishtan to plant, and we're going to follow majority, which by the way is rough. But they say, lots of people buy them for other things, which means the majority won't help you here because the majority actually buy for other things and not for planting. So you wouldn't get your money back. So now they want to know Mantana. So we actually saw three opinions here, or sort of, that we're going to see. So who's the machloket Tana in between? Rabbi Yossi v'amrulo, if it's between Rabbi Yossi and the people who responded to Rabbi Yossi. Travayu bataruba azle. They both actually are following majority. It's just they have a disagreement about how to assess the majority. And this is very interesting. If you ever took a course in statistics, for example, or know anything about statistics, you know that you can always tweak them to show, or you can not always, but you can often tweak statistics to show what you want. It's really a matter of what you take out of it. So this is really relevant for here, which is Mar Azo Bataruba di Inashe, Umar Azo Bataruba Dizria. They're each focusing on a different majority. It's not that they have a different disagreement about the reality of it. Just the Amrulo said many people, the majority of people buy flax seeds for other reasons, not for planting. But the Tanakama, Rabbi Yossi held Bataruba Dizria. Most flax seeds are planted. Okay, think about it. Even though most flax seeds in the world are planted, still you could say when you look at the buyers, the majority of buyers in the world buy flax seeds for other things. By the way, they use it for medicinal purposes and eating purposes. So it's a matter of, right, we know that there's a lot of health value. Nowadays, it's very popular using flax seeds because there's a lot of health value to it, also medicinal. So it's a matter of, do we look at the majority of flax seeds or do we look at the majority of buyers? Which majority do we go by? But they both hold by majority. The majority determines it, right? One will say majority determines and therefore you should get your money back. The other said majority determines that you shouldn't get your money back. But neither of them holds that we don't hold by majority like Shmuel. So they both hold like Rav. So therefore, Eli Tanakama Rabbi Yossi Tanakama Ba'amrulo. So the machloka must be either or both, really, between Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi. Tanakama saying we don't follow majority like Shmuel, and Rabbi Yossi saying we do, or Tanakama and the Amrulo, where again the Amrulo say we do follow majority, and Tanakama says no. So Tanakama, Rabbi Yossi, Tanakama matches with Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi and the Amrulo match with Rav. It's just a matter that they disagree about how we calculate majority. So that's the end of the first section for today's stuff. Then we're going to move on to the second section, but maybe we'll review right now. So we had our Mishna, the whole reason we brought this big machloket, Rav and Shmuel, about do we follow majority in Dinei Mamonot or do we not follow majority in Dinei Mamonot, was all to get to the reason why it was brought here is to get to that final source and to basically show that the machloket Rav and Shmuel is actually a machloket Tanaim and that our Mishnah only really is Shmuel and not Rav's position. And we also got to other sources trying to say, again, can we prove one or the other from these sources? We weren't able to. Can we prove there's a machloket Tanaim? No. Only from this last source we brought did we show actually it's a machloket Tanaim. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to bring a braita, which brings up a different issue. When you go to return the money, okay, the seeds, let's say it's a case where either like Rav, where the majority of people buy it for planting, or it's a case like Shmuel, where it's only sold for planting, right? And like it said in our Mishnah, right, like Rashbag said, and the way we understood also in that braita, that if it's only sold for seeds, then you get your money back. So the braita here starts off with Mahu Notenlo. What do you get back? So obviously you get Demei Zera, the amount of money for the seeds. But what else happened? You planted those seeds and you put in fertilizer and other things. Maybe you had to buy soil. Maybe you had to hire workers. So do you get your expenses back also? According to Tanakama here, no. Lo hotza. You don't get your expenses back. Just what you planted. What you bought, right, that went bad, that didn't work. V'yesh omrim, although there are those who say, af hotza, even your expenses. So now the Gemara wants to know, man yesh omrim, who holds by this opinion? Which Tana? It's some say. Who's the some say? Amar Rav Chisda Rashbag. Rashbag said, Rav Chisda says it's Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. So now the Gemara wants to know, where do we see that Rav Shimon ben Gamliel holds this way? Where did Rav Chisda get it from? Which opinion of Rav Shimon ben Gamliel matches this? And for that, we're going to start with our Mishnah. Hey, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. Hey always means which one. Which Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is this? Which statement of his? It's not which Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. It's which statement of Rav Shimon ben Gamliel do we see this opinion? Ilema, if you're going to say, which is always going to be rejected, just like earlier we said savrua, they thought, and it always means this will be rejected, or lema kitchenai means let's suggest it's a machloket tanaim, but it's also always rejected. There's always those words that give you a hint to what's about to come. Ilema means if we say, well, I have a problem with that. It's not going to work. So if you say it's a way of getting something by process of elimination, knocking out this one, knocking out that one. Okay, so Ilema Rashbag Matnitin, if you're going to say Rashbag in our Mishnah, Ditna. Now, we talked about this when we read the Mishnah, which is it wasn't clear does Rashbag disagree with the rabbis or not. It really seems like they agree. And Rashbag's just clarifying. So let's talk about that. Ditnan, Hamocher Perot Lechavero, Uzaran Velot Samchu. That's the beginning of our Mishnah. If you sell fruit, produce, and they planted them and nothing, the buyer plants them and nothing happens, even if it's zera pishtan, which is normally sold for seeds, right, for replanting, you can't return them. Ema seifa, now look at the end. Rashbag omer, but if they're only sold, nobody eats them, they're only sold for planting, then you are responsible. Tanakama nami hachi kamar. Well, doesn't Tanakama agree with that? How do we know? Because Tanakama said zera pishtan hu de'eno chayav achayutan. Specifically, if it's flax seeds, you're not responsible, which would imply because flax seeds sometimes people eat them. But but obviously, then you can infer from the first part of the Mishnah that even according to Tanakama, if there was which is kind of what we thought the Mishnah was saying, which means Rashbag is saying the same thing as Tanakama. But the Gemara doesn't want to assume that they say the same thing, because if they say the same thing, then it should have just all been one opinion. Why does it then say Rashbag says? So it must be they disagree about something that, as you would say, is hidden from the eye, which would be what? Exactly our topic. It must be that Rashbag is adding something. What's Rashbag adding? Then not only are you obligated to pay for the seeds, if it's seeds that can't be eaten, but you're also obligated to pay to reimburse for all the expenses. And then we're going to say Mar Savar Dmei Zera. Tanakama holds just the value of the seeds. Mar Savar Afotza. And Rashbag says even the expenses. So now we're going to basically say, and I just want to make sure it's clear, the fact that Rashbag disagrees, even though it seems like they really don't disagree, must mean they do disagree about something. It's something that doesn't say explicitly, but that there's something that Rashbag must be adding on to Tanakama. To which the Gemara says, wait, if you're going to assume that their debate is about whether you reimburse for the expenses or not, well, why do you assume Rashbag is the one? Because remember, Rav Chisda said it's Rashbag who holds this, but why do you assume Rashbag is the one? Maybe Tanakama says you pay for the expenses and Rashbag says you don't. And that's the disagreement between them. And that's the fact that they disagree about expenses, okay, I'll accept. But who's to say that's the direction? Maybe it's the opposite. And then that would make sense because Rav Chisda said it's Rashbag. In other words, this is all arbitrary. Gemara says, no, it's not arbitrary. Because halokasha, that's not a difficulty, because kol tana batra l'tfuye milta ka'ate. When someone comes to add on to something, they're obviously coming to add on some additional expense. If the later one in the Mishnah is always coming to add, or in any tannaitic source is coming to add on more. If Rashbag is saying not only that, but something else, then they must be adding more. So Rashbag must be the one who adds if one of them is actually adding. So until now, we're going to assume, and this is all in the Ilema, if you remember, if you say it's Rashbag in our Mishnah, then that's how you would read our Mishnah. Even though it looks like they're not disagreeing, they must be disagreeing. And on what? About the expenses. And it would stand to reason that Rashbag would be adding and not Tanakama. But the Gemara now says, but we have a different way of reading the Mishnah. And this was kind of how I suggested reading it in the beginning, which is Dilma Kula Rashbag. Maybe the whole thing was Rashbag, meaning there's really no disagreement. And it's a little different than I said, which is, when we read it, it sounds like Rashbag is just agreeing with Tanakama, but clarifying it. But here they're saying maybe the whole thing is really Rashbag's opinion only. And then, how would you read it? You read the Mishnah as if it's missing words, which often we do. We edit a Mishnah and say, well, it's missing a few words. This is how it should read. This is just like our Mishnah. You sell produce, and you planted them and nothing grew. Even flaxseed. You're not responsible, right? The seller doesn't have to reimburse. Divrei Rashbag. Here come the added words. These are the words of Rashbag. Shev Rashbag Omer. How do we know? Because Rashbag said somewhere else, which mean the same thing. Only if there's seeds in a garden which don't get eaten at all, then you're going to have to compensate. The seller's going to have to compensate the buyer. But anything other than that, right, would imply the beginning of the Mishnah. So it can't be then that it's so clear from our Mishnah that Rashbag is the one who talks about the expenses, because there's a different way to understand this, that there's no machlokah between them at all. So they reject that whole first answer. As I told you, we would. Ella, Rav and Shmuel ben Gamliel. Must be this Rav and Shmuel ben Gamliel. We're going to quote a different one, which is going to get us off on a bit of a tangent about eating and guests and customs, etc. Titanya, as it says in a braita, Hamolich chitim latachon, which really should be latochin. You bring wheat to the grinder to make you flour. Velo letatan, and he didn't soak them. Basa'an subin or morsan, and they turned into bran or like bad flour, basically. Kemach lenachtom, you brought flour to a baker. Second case, va'afa'o patni polin, and he made bread that fell apart. Right, it didn't come out good. Behema letabach, and as you brought the raw ingredients to someone and they ruined them. You brought an animal, letabach, to the butcher, v'nibla, and he shechted it in a non-kosher way, right? It was not a good shechita and ruined your animal, and now you can't serve it to not your family, not to your guests, okay? And now assuming you're going home to your guests. So even if you weren't going home to guests, chayav. That person who you hired a specialist to do something for you, and you presumably paid them for it, and then they ruined it, well, you get your money back, okay? They pay you for what the loss, chayav. Actually, the sugi came up in Bava, and there it says he is an osei sachar, not he's like an osei sachar, because he's getting paid a salary. Okay, just like a person who's guarding something for money is responsible for the items, so also here they're responsible. They messed up your item, they have to pay you. Comes Rashbag, and here's the Rashbag we're looking for. Rashbag omeo noteno demei boshto demei boshet chaf. Not only that, but they have to pay for the embarrassment for you and for your guests. If you go home now and you don't have food to feed guests, that's embarrassing. Or you go home to your family and there's no food to feed them. It's a humiliation that there's no food in your house. So they also have to add the boshet. Now that's very similar. It's not the same thing. It's very similar to what we have by us. Not only do you have to compensate the person on their loss of the fact that the seeds didn't grow, but you also have to compensate them for their expenses. Furthermore, Rav and Shmuel ben Gamliel said something else. And here we get into customs of meals. Minhag gadol haya b'Yerushalayim. There was a minhag. Now we're just getting off topic a little bit. Hamosir su'uda lechavero v'kilkala. If you hire a caterer to cook your food, okay, you say you're responsible for making this meal happen, and the person ruins the food. Notain lo demei boshto demei boshet or chav. They give you the food for the humiliation and for the humiliation of your guests. Okay, this reminds me of a story. My son's bris, which was 25 years ago. So it was Friday morning, and Friday night we have a meal with the family. All the family, they come in from abroad. And my parents decide, let's get the meal catered so we don't have to, we'll be available to help. So they got it catered. And luckily, it was a bit unlucky for us, but my son wasn't doing so great. After the bris, we went home at the beginning of the meal. We didn't eat, and everyone else got sick from the food. The caterer had, obviously, there was food poisoning, whatever happened with the food, I don't know exactly, but everyone got sick. And in fact, a bunch of them got sick on the plane on the way home. They all remember the story. It was pretty awful. So, first of all, we were lucky. We got away with not getting sick. But, now that I'm reading the sugya, I realized that we should have sued for, the humiliation, right? Now, luckily it was only family. It wasn't like a huge meal with a catered meal with lots of guests, but it was still an embarrassment in front of the people in the family, and it's pretty unpleasant for everybody. So anyway, it's probably a little too late to sue them, but that, right, that was the same kind of thing here, which, you gave it to someone to cook and then they ruined the food. And then, right, in this case, right, they bought the food and all that, but still here we paid the money for the food and it was awful. And also he would say another minhag about meals and guests, which is really not related, but it's related because it was a minhag. There was another big minhag custom in Jerusalem. Mapa prusa, by the way, this whole thing was in Jerusalem, so appropriate. Mapa prusa gabe petach. Okay, there's a few different explanations of this, but let's assume it's someone having a big feast and they invite guests. Okay, nowadays, what do? You have RSVPs. Now there's so many online systems that do it really well for you. But basically, you calculate how many guests you're having, and then you tell the caterer, they prepare food for that many people. In those days, apparently, they didn't do this. And when you had a big feast, it was a problem because you didn't know how many people to cook for. And what if you run out of food in the middle? So what they would do is this. They would have a sign. They would put a mapa, a big cloth, prusal gavei petach, on the entrance. And that would be a sign that there's still food left. So kol zman shamapa prusa, orchim nichnasim. So people would still come in if you come late to the wedding. And they took the mapa off already. Okay, nistalka mapa, if the mapa's not there, ein orchim nichnasim. You can't go in anymore because if you go in, they're not going to have any food to serve you. They're basically telling you the food is gone. This is really literally first come, first serve, right? You come late, there won't be any food for you. So they would pull down the mapan and people would know not to come in so as not to embarrass the host and so that they wouldn't, come in and there would be nothing to eat, or at least they would know when they came in. Some people say that anyway, people would come in and wish mazal tov, but they would know already that there's no food for them. That's one of the interpretations of how to understand this. Okay, so just to review before we get to the very end of the daf. So the second section of today's daf was about, we already reviewed the first part, which is connected to yesterday's, to give the machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Second part was, in the case where you can return the seeds, do you also get payback for your expenses? And then we said, according to Yesh Omrim, yes. Who's the Yesh Omrim? Rav Chisda said it was Rashbag. And then we went through sources to figure out. We have one source thinking it was our Mishna, not Rashbag in our Mishna, but it is Rashbag as we found in that other braita. And from there we got to a bunch of other customs about meals. New Mishnah. Hamochir pirot lechavero. Somebody sells fruit, again, produce to a friend. Hareza mekabel alav. Now we're going to talk about 4 different items, different kinds of things. There's a certain amount that we assume if you're selling large quantities, there's a certain percentage that could be bad. Okay, so if it's grains, hareza mekabel alav rova tinofet l'seah. For every seah, you can assume there's a quarter kav of junk in there, like pebbles, chaff, all that stuff. Okay, now what's the percentage? What's the ratio? It's 1 in 24 because a kav there's 6 kav in a se'ah. So a kav is 1/6 of a se'ah, and this is 1/4 of 1/6 of the se'ah because it's a quarter. So it's a quarter tinofet a quarter kav per se'ah. So that's 1/4 of 1/6 of the se'ah. So it's 1 in 24. Te'enim, figs, mekabel av eser metula'im lameh. 10 rotten ones in every batch of 100. Martev shal yain, again, this is in a sale. If you sell huge, tons of barrels of wine, mekabel av eser kosasot lameh, there could be 10 that are on their way out already, smelling like vinegar, out of 100. Kankanim b'Sharon, in the Sharon, they would sell, the Sharon area, that's where I live, in the center of Israel, in the certain area in the center called the Sharon. There's jugs in the Sharon area. You can assume kabel of eser pitasot lemea. There could be 10 broken ones, okay, that you really can't fill up out of 100. So now it's like it's interesting theory that there's an assumption when you buy things in bulk, there's going to be a certain percentage of messed up, of ruined things, and you can't return them. Tani Rav Katina. So the Gemara starts off with a version that Rav Katina had. Notice his name was Katina, and he's going to talk about kidney. Okay, often the names are connected to what they talk about. Rova kidney l'seah. His version of the Mishnah had not a quarter of chaff and garbage stuff, but a quarter kav of kidneyot in legumes in the se'ah of wheat, because often legumes and wheats would be sold next to each other and they'd mix in. You ever go to one of these called a pitzuchia nut store, or where they sell also in Israel, it's very common, or in the shuk, they sell all the grains next to each other and the legumes, and often you buy them and there's all sorts of things mixed in, right? It's never good for people who are gluten-free. It's also sorts of things are mixed in. This is one of the reasons why they say kitniyot became forbidden on Pesach in Ashkenazi communities, because they would often sell them near each other and they would get mixed in. That's why also Sfaradim sort their rice very well on Pesach. Those who do eat kitniyot often sort it, right? Because you want to make sure there's nothing mixed in. So it's only one of the possible reasons for why kitniyot developed. That's a whole other topic. Anyway, Rova kidney l'seah. So he has not chaff, but kidney. So now that assumes afarit lo. It sounds like pebbles and garbage and, chaff wouldn't be. V'ha'amar, right, if there's some pieces of dirt in them. V'ha'amar Rava bar Chia ketos va'ah mishum mishmei de Rabba, but Rabba bar Chia ketos va'ah said in the name of Rabba, if you took a pebble from the floor of my threshing floor, you actually have to reimburse me not for the value of a pebble, but for the value of a grain of wheat. Because when I sell my wheat in the store and I gather it from the threshing floor, if there were some pebbles on the ground, I'm going to sell those pebbles with it. And I'm going to get the value of a grain of wheat, even though a pebble's worth a lot less. Because the assumption is I sell my wheat with any pebbles mixed in, and again, certain percentage. And we assume that's a valid sale, because otherwise, why would you have to compensate me for the value of, if you took a pebble, you should have to compensate me for the value of a pebble, not of a grain of wheat. But it says for a grain of wheat because we assume that I can sell it with the pebble. So that seems to go against what Rav Katina said, because he said only kidney, which sounds like actual food, not pebbles. So we'll get back to this tomorrow and we'll see what the resolution is to that question. With this, we'll finish today's daf. Wishing everyone a good day.